I never thought the scar of my life would be right on my wrist, disguised as a strange tattoo my mother and I both had. I was just a mechanic with oil-stained hands, and Robert Sterling owned half of Chicago real estate. But when he saw that ink in my shabby workshop, the billionaire did the unthinkable. He trembled, shed tears, and knelt right before my dust-covered shoes. But that was just the start of a terrifying storm. My name is James Martinez, and for the last 10 years, my life has been measured in the grime under my fingernails and the stack of unpaid medical bills on my kitchen counter. I work at a place called Iron Dust, a garage tucked away in the forgotten industrial outskirts of Chicago, where the wind cuts through the corrugated metal walls like a knife made of ice. I am 34 years old, but my back aches like I am 50, and my hands are permanently stained with the black blood of engines that cost more than I will earn in a lifetime. To the people who drive past on the highway, Iron Dust is just another eyesore, a graveyard for rusted metal and broken dreams. But to the few who know it, is a sanctuary. I do not just fix cars, I resurrect them. I take things that the world has discarded, and I breathe life back into them. It is the only thing I have ever been good at. It is the only thing that keeps the lights on in the small, drafty apartment where my mother Maria fights for every breath she takes. Her lungs are failing. The doctors use long, complicated words to explain it, but the reality is simple. She is dying, and I am too poor to stop it. Every morning I leave her side, listening to the wheezing rattle in her chest, and I come here to fix toys for men who have never known a day of hunger in their lives. Then came the Rolls-Royce. It arrived on a Tuesday, carried on the back of a flatbed truck that looked too clean for our neighborhood. It was a 1934 Phantom II, a massive, imposing beast of a vehicle. Even under the layers of dust and neglect, it commanded respect. It had curves like a woman from a forgotten era, and a grille that looked like the gates to a palace. But the paint was a disaster. Someone had tried to restore it, and failed miserably, leaving it a patchy, uneven mess. The driver of the truck handed me a clipboard with an air of disdain. He told me the owner was Robert Sterling. My stomach dropped. Everyone in Chicago knew Robert Sterling. He was the king of real estate, the man who owned the skyline. They called him the Iron Lord. Stories about him were legendary and terrifying. They said he had ice water in his veins. They said he once evicted an entire orphanage because they missed a rent payment by 2 days. He was a man who demanded perfection and destroyed anyone who offered him anything less. The instructions were simple, but terrifying. The car needed to be restored to its original glory. Specifically, the paint. It had to be a specific shade of cobalt blue. I looked at the driver. I told him that cobalt blue was a standard color. The driver sneered at me. He told me that 3 other mechanics had said the same thing. They had all been fired. One of them had been sued. Mr. Sterling did not want just blue. He wanted the blue he remembered from 1990. He wanted the blue of a specific memory. If I could not do it, I should refuse the job now and save us both the time. I wanted to say no. My gut told me to walk away. But then I thought about the pharmacy bill sitting in my pocket. I thought about the way my mother looked when she could not afford the good oxygen tanks. I looked at the car, and I looked at the driver, and I nodded. I told him to leave it. For the next 3 days, I did not go home. I did not sleep. I barely ate. I turned the garage into a laboratory. I stripped that car down to its bare metal bones. I sanded it by hand, feeling every curve, every imperfection in the steel. My fingers bled, wrapped in tape, but I kept going. The cold in the shop was brutal. The heater had broken a week ago, and the Chicago winter was seeping in through the cracks in the floor. My breath came out in white clouds as I worked mixing paint samples under the harsh glare of the halogen lights. I mixed 40 different shades of blue. Too dark, too light, too metallic, too flat. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine what a man like Robert Sterling would remember. A man with everything who was never satisfied. What kind of blue would haunt him? It had to be deep. It had to look like the ocean at midnight, It had to look like sorrow. I found it at 3 in the morning on the third day. It was a mixture of deep navy, a touch of violet, and a microscopic amount of silver flake that you could only see if the light hit it exactly right. When I sprayed the test panel, I knew. This was it. It was beautiful, and it was sad. It was the color of a bruise on a beautiful face. I spent the next 20 hours painting, layer after layer, sanding between coats with grit so fine it felt like paper, buffing until my arms felt like they were going to fall off. The fumes made me dizzy, and the lack of sleep made the edges of my vision blur, but I did not stop. I was possessed. I needed this money. I needed to prove that I was not just grease and trash. By the time I finished, the car did not look like a machine. It looked like liquid water frozen in time. It was perfect. The deadline was 5 in the afternoon on Friday. At 4 o'clock, the sky turned a dark, bruised gray, and the snow began to fall. It came down in thick, heavy sheets, blanketing the dirty streets of the suburbs in white. I was terrified the truck would not make it through the storm. I was wiping down the chrome bumper with a microfiber cloth, checking for dust motes that did not exist. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I heard the rumble of an engine outside, not a truck. An SUV. I hit the button to roll up the bay door. The gears groaned in protest against the cold. The wind howled in bringing a swirl of snowflakes that danced around the newly painted Phantom. 3 black SUVs pulled up right to the entrance. Men in dark suits and earpieces spilled out, forming a perimeter. They looked at me then, at the shop, with open disgust. Then the middle door opened. Robert Sterling stepped out. He was older than he looked in the magazines. He was tall, wearing a cashmere coat that probably cost more than my entire garage. He leaned heavily on a cane, made of polished ebony with a silver handle. His face was lined with deep crevices, his eyes sharp and gray, scanning the room like a predator looking for weakness. He did not look at me. He looked straight at the car. The silence stretched out heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the wind whistling outside and the ticking of the cooling metal. Sterling walked toward the car. His limp was pronounced. Click step, click step. The sound of his cane hitting the concrete floor echoed in the quiet shop. He stopped 3 feet away from the fender. He stood there for a long time. He did not move. He just stared at the paint. I held my breath. I clenched my hands behind my back to stop them from shaking. I prepared myself for the shouting. I prepared myself to be fired, to be sued, to go home to my mother and tell her I had failed. Then Robert Sterling did something I did not expect. He took off his leather glove. He reached out and touched the hood of the car. He ran his hand over the curve of the fender, his fingers trembling slightly. He whispered something I could not hear. He turned to look at me. For the first time, he actually saw me. His eyes were not angry. They were wet. He said that it was perfect. He said it was exactly right. The relief hit me so hard I almost fell over. My knees went weak. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 3 days. Sterling walked over to me. He stood right in front of me, imposing and powerful. He told me that I had a gift. He said that he had not seen craftsmanship like this in 30 years. He said that he wanted to shake my hand. He extended his right hand. I was flustered. I was exhausted, delirious from hunger and fumes. It was hot in the shop because I had dragged in portable heaters to cure the paint, and I had been working in a frenzy. I had rolled the sleeves of my flannel shirt up past my elbows. My arms were covered in grease and dust. I reached out to take his hand. As I extended my arm, the sleeve bunched up higher. The fluorescent light above us flickered and buzzed, casting a harsh white glow on the underside of my wrist. There, stark against my pale, dirt-streaked skin, was the tattoo. It is not a large tattoo. It is about the size of a silver dollar. It is a design of a crescent moon, sharp and curved, resting inside the spread wing of a falcon. It is done in black ink, simple lines slightly faded with age. I have had it since I was 18. Robert Sterling froze. His hand was inches from mine. His eyes dropped to my wrist. The air left the room. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like he had been struck dead. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The powerful, terrifying billionaire looked suddenly fragile, like a piece of glass about to shatter. The ebony cane slipped from his fingers. It hit the concrete floor with a loud, jarring clatter that made the bodyguards jump. They stepped forward, hands reaching into their jackets, thinking I had done something, thinking I had attacked him. But Sterling held up a shaking hand to stop them. He did not look away from my wrist. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. He took a stumbling step forward. He grabbed my hand. His grip was surprisingly strong, desperate. He pulled my arm closer to his face, his eyes wide and wild. He traced the outline of the tattoo with his thumb. His voice was a broken rasp when he spoke. He asked me why. He asked me why I had this symbol. I was confused. I was scared. I tried to pull my hand back, but he would not let go. The bodyguards were tense, watching us like hawks. I looked at Sterling, and I saw raw, naked pain in his eyes. I told him the truth. I stammered that I did not know what it meant. I told him that my mother has the same tattoo. She has had it for as long as I can remember. She told me to get it when I turned 18 so we would always be connected. The words hung in the air. Robert Sterling let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. It was the sound of a man whose heart was breaking all over again. And then right there on the dirty oil-stained floor of my garage, amidst the smell of gasoline and solvent, the richest man in Chicago did the impossible. He buckled. His legs gave out. He fell to his knees. He did not care about his cashmere coat dragging in the grease. He did not care about his bodyguards watching in shock. He did not care about the snow blowing in through the open door. He held onto my hand like it was a lifeline. He pressed his forehead against my knuckles, and he began to weep. He cried with the deep, heaving sobs of a man who has carried a burden for too long. His shoulders shook violently. Tears ran down his face and dripped onto my work boots. I stood there, paralyzed, looking down at the top of his head. I looked at the other mechanics who had gathered in the shadows, their mouths open in disbelief. I looked at the bodyguards who were frozen in confusion. I had expected a paycheck. I had expected a handshake. I had expected arrogance. I did not expect this. I did not know that the man kneeling in the dirt at my feet was not crying for a stranger. He was crying for a past that I did not know I belonged to. I did not know that the tattoo on my wrist was a key, and I had just unlocked a door that should have stayed shut. The storm outside was raging now, howling against the metal walls, but the storm inside the garage was far more dangerous. And I was standing right in the eye of it. The moment Robert Sterling hit the concrete, the air in the garage shifted from stunned silence to violent potential. Two of his security detail surged forward, their hands diving inside their suit jackets for weapons that I knew were far more lethal than a wrench or a tire iron. They saw a mechanic standing over their fallen employer, and they assumed the worst. I reacted on instinct. I did not step back. I reached down and grabbed the billionaire by his cashmere elbows. He was heavy, dead weight, trembling so violently that his vibrations traveled up my arms. "Back off," I shouted at the suits. My voice cracked, but it was loud enough to make them hesitate for a fraction of a second. That was all the time Robert needed. "Stand down," he croaked. His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but the authority in it was absolute. He did not look at his men. He did not look at the other mechanics gawking from the shadows. He looked only at me, his eyes wide and rimmed with red, searching my face, as if it were a map to a treasure he had lost decades ago. He clawed at my sleeve, using me to pull himself upright. He was an old man at that moment, stripped of his empire and his arrogance. When he was finally on his feet, he did not let go of my arm. He gripped it so tight, I could feel his fingernails digging into my skin through the flannel. "Take me to her," he said. It was not a request. It was a plea from a man drowning. I looked at the open bay door. The blizzard had worsened. Snow was blowing sideways, accumulating in drifts against the walls. The roads would be a nightmare. I told him that the weather was turning, that we should wait. He shook his head violently. Now, he insisted. I need to see Maria. Now. The use of her name sent a jolt of electricity down my spine. Hearing it on his lips felt wrong, like a violation of the secret life my mother and I had built in the shadows. But looking at the desperation in his eyes, I knew he would walk through the snow in his Italian leather shoes if I refused. We did not take my beat-up pickup truck. We took his lead, SUV. I sat in the back with Robert while his driver navigated the whiteout conditions with terrifying precision. The interior of the car smelled of expensive leather and conditioned air, a stark contrast to the smell of gasoline and sweat that clung to my clothes. I felt like an intruder in a spaceship. For the first 10 minutes, Robert said nothing. He just stared at my wrist, which was now resting on my knee. I had rolled my sleeve down, but he seemed to see right through the fabric. Finally, he spoke. His voice was steady now, but hollow. 35 years ago, he began looking out the window at the swirling snow. I was not a tycoon. I was an art student. My father wanted me to study business to take over the empire. I wanted to paint. I spent my nights in a small studio in the arts district. That is where I met her. I stayed silent. I did not want to interrupt. I needed to know why this stranger was unraveling my life. She was a waitress at the diner downstairs, he continued. Maria. She was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Not because of her face, though, that was lovely, but because of her spirit. She was fierce. She was fire. We fell in love hard and fast. It was the kind of love that burns everything else down. He turned to me, his gray eyes locking onto mine. I designed that tattoo for her, he said softly. The crescent moon for the light she brought into my dark world. The falcon wing for the freedom we both desperately wanted. I drew it on a napkin at the diner. We promised to get matching ones. It was our pact. A promise that we would fly away together, away from my family, away from her poverty. I shifted uncomfortably in the plush seat. This did not sound like the mother I knew. My mother was tired. She was sad. She was a woman who had been beaten down by life, not a fiery spirit who planned escapes with billionaires. My mother told me my father was a drunk who left before I was born. I said, my voice defensive. She said he was a nobody. Robert winced as if I had slapped him. My parents, he said, the words dripping with bitterness. They found out. They threatened to cut me off. I did not care. I was ready to leave it all. But then came the fire. He paused, swallowing hard. I was away for a weekend trying to secure a loan so we could move to California. When I came back, her apartment building was gone, burned to the ground. The police told me they found a body. They told me it was her. They showed me items, her locket, a scarf I bought her. My parents told me to come home to heal. They said it was a tragedy, but perhaps for the best. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built a skyline. I believed them, he whispered. For 35 years, I have visited an empty grave on the anniversary of that fire. I have lived a half-life, James. I married a woman I did not love because I thought my heart had burned to ash in that building. The SUV hit a pothole, jolting us. I looked out the window. We were entering my neighborhood now. The streetlights were broken here. The snow was piled high on the sidewalks because the city plows rarely came this far south. The buildings were brick tenements, dark and foreboding. I did not know what to believe. His story had the ring of truth, but it contradicted everything I had ever been told. If he thought she was dead, why did she tell me he abandoned us? Why the lies? We pulled up in front of the building. It was a 4-story walk-up with peeling paint and barred windows. A group of men standing around a burning trash barrel stared at the convoy of luxury black vehicles with open hostility. Robert opened the door before the driver could get out. He stepped into the slush, ruining his shoes instantly. He did not care. He looked up at the building, his face a mask of anguish. Which floor? He asked. 3rd, I said. Apartment 3B. The stairs smelled of boiled cabbage, stale cigarette smoke and damp plaster. Robert climbed them slowly, his breath wheezing slightly. He refused my help. He needed to do this on his own power. When we reached the door of 3B, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the knob. I was about to blow up my mother's world. I was about to bring the past crashing into her fragile present. I opened the door. The apartment was warm, overheated by the radiator that we could not adjust. It was small, cluttered with the accumulation of a hard life, but clean. My mother was sitting in her usual armchair by the window, a heavy wool blanket draped over her legs. The rhythmic click-click-click of her knitting needles was the only sound in the room. She looked up as the draft from the hallway hit her. Her face was pale, her cheekbones sharp against her paper-thin skin. Her hair, once black, was now entirely gray. A clear plastic tube ran under her nose, connected to the oxygen tank that hummed softly in the corner. "James," she said, her voice raspy, "you are early." "Did you finish the—" Her voice died in her throat. She saw him. Robert stood in the doorway, snow melting on the shoulders of his coat. He was staring at her as if she were a ghost, his mouth slightly open, tears already welling up again in his eyes. "Maria," he whispered. It was a sound so full of longing and pain that it made my chest ache. My mother did not smile. She did not cry. Her eyes went wide with a terror I had never seen before. It was a primal fear, the look of a trapped animal. "No," she gasped. She dropped her knitting. The ball of red yarn rolled across the floor, unraveling like a trail of blood. "No! Get out!" She grabbed the metal knitting needles from her lap and hurled them at him. They clattered harmlessly against the doorframe, but the violence of the action was shocking, coming from a woman who could barely walk to the kitchen. "Maria." "It is me." Robert stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender. "I am here. I found you." "Get away from us!" she screamed, her voice rising to a shriek that triggered a coughing fit. She clutched her chest, her face turning red. You promised they would never find us." I rushed to her side, grabbing her shoulders to steady her. "Mom, calm down, please. You have to breathe." She pushed me away with surprising strength, her eyes locked on Robert. "Did they send you?" she hissed. "Did your parents send you to finish it? To kill him?" Robert froze. Confusion washed over his grief. "My parents. Maria. My parents are dead. They died 10 years ago." "I thought you were dead. They told me you died in the fire." The room went deadly silent. The only sound was the hiss of the oxygen tank and the wind rattling the window pane. My mother stopped struggling. She looked at Robert, really looked at him for the first time. She saw the confusion, the genuine heartbreak in his posture. "They told you I died?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Robert choked out. "I mourned you. Every day." My mother let out a laugh that sounded like a sob. She slumped back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. "Lies," she wept. "All lies." I looked from one to the other, the pieces falling into place, but the picture they formed was monstrous. "Mom," I said gently. "What happened? Tell us." She lowered her hands. She looked at me, then at Robert. "They came to me the night you left for the loan," she said to Robert. 3 men. They put a gun to my stomach. They told me I was carrying a mongrel that would ruin the Sterling bloodline. Robert let out a strangled noise, clutching the doorframe for support. "They gave me a choice," she continued, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "They said I could disappear, fake my death, and never contact you again. If I did that, they would let the baby live. If I tried to find you, if I ever spoke your name, they would kill us both. They burned the building to cover my tracks. They made me watch from the street." She looked at Robert with infinite sadness. "I did it for him," she pointed to me. "I lived in hell for 34 years so he could breathe. I thought you knew. I thought you agreed to it. They told me you signed the check to pay for my silence." Robert slid down the doorframe until he was sitting on the floor. He buried his face in his hands. The realization was physically crushing him. His entire life, his resentment, his coldness, his isolation. It was all engineered by the people who were supposed to love him. He had been a puppet in a cruel play written by his own parents. I did not know, he sobbed into his hands. I swear to God, Maria, I did not know. They stole my life. They stole our son. He looked up at me then. It was the first time he acknowledged me as his son, not just a mechanic with a familiar tattoo. There was shame in his eyes, but also a desperate, overwhelming love. I am so sorry, he whispered to both of us. I have so much money. I have buildings, I have power, I have the world. But I am the poorest man alive because I did not have this. I did not have you. He crawled across the worn linoleum floor toward her chair. He did not look like a billionaire. He looked like a penitent sinner. He reached out and took her hand, the hand that was trembling on the armrest. Forgive me, he begged. Not for what I did, but for what I was too blind to see. My mother looked at him. The anger was fading, replaced by exhaustion. The adrenaline that had sustained her outburst was gone, leaving her frail body on the verge of collapse. She lifted her hand and touched his face, her thumb brushing away a tear on his cheek. Robert, she whispered. You are old. So are you, he smiled through his tears. Then her eyes rolled back in her head. Her hand went limp and fell from his face. The monitor on her oxygen tank began to beep in alarm. Mom! I shouted. Robert scrambled up, his panic instantaneous. We need a hospital now! I scooped my mother up in my arms. She felt terrifyingly light, like a bundle of dry sticks. Robert was already at the door, yelling down the hallway for his security team. We ran down the stairs, the three of us bound together by a tragedy that had started 3 decades ago. The hatred I had felt for the rich man in the Rolls-Royce was gone, replaced by a shared frantic terror. We were not mechanic and billionaire anymore. We were a father and a son racing against time to save the woman who had sacrificed her life to keep us apart. As we burst out into the snowy night, the cold wind hit us, but it was nothing compared to the chill of the truth we had just uncovered. The past was not dead. It had just been waiting for the snow to clear. The silence of a VIP hospital suite is different from the silence of the waiting rooms I was used to. It does not smell of bleach and desperation. It smells of fresh lilies and filtered air that cost $2,000 a night. Outside the tinted windows, the Chicago skyline was a blur of gray snow and blinking lights, but inside, room 402, the world had shrunk down to the steady, rhythmic beeping of my mother's heart monitor. News had traveled faster than the storm. By the time we had gotten my mother settled, the paparazzi were already swarming the hospital entrance like vultures, sensing a carcass. I could see their flashbulbs popping down on the street, trying to catch a glimpse of the Robert Sterling. They were writing headlines in their heads already. The billionaire and the bag lady. The prince and the pauper. They did not know the truth. They did not know that the woman lying in that bed, looking so small beneath the starch-white sheets, was the only real thing in Robert Sterling's life. But while the cameras flashed outside, a different kind of storm was brewing in the Sterling mansion. I did not witness it firsthand, but I would learn every detail later. I can imagine it vividly. Victoria Sterling, Robert's wife of 20 years, pacing across her Persian rugs, her heels clicking like gunshots. She was a woman who had married a checkbook, not a man. And Eric, her son, my half-brother technically, though the thought made bile rise in my throat, lounging on a silk sofa, swirling scotch in a crystal glass. They were not grieving the potential loss of a family member. They were terrified of the division of assets. They saw my mother not as a dying woman, but as a leak in their bank account. I sat in the corner of the hospital room watching Robert, the Iron Lord of Chicago, the man who could crush unions with a phone call. He was sitting in a plastic chair pulled right up to the bedside, his expensive suit jacket discarded on the floor. He was peeling an apple. It was such a mundane, simple task, but watching him do it was painful. His hands, usually so steady when signing billion-dollar contracts, were shaking. He held the small paring knife, awkwardly hacking at the fruit rather than peeling it. He cut too deep, taking chunks of the white flesh away with the red skin. He was trying to be useful. He was trying to be a husband 35 years too late. "Here," he said, his voice soft. He held out a slice of apple to my mother. She was asleep, sedated by the doctors to ease the strain on her heart, but he offered it anyway, as if the gesture alone could nourish her. He looked at me then. The silence between us was heavy, filled with 3 decades of questions I was too exhausted to ask. "You used a glaze, didn't you?" he asked suddenly. I blinked, confused. "What?" "On the Phantom," he said, looking down at the mangled apple in his hands. "The paint. You did not just mix the blue. You layered it with a translucent glaze before the clear coat. That is how you got that depth. Like looking into deep water." I sat up a little straighter. Of all the things he could have discussed, the money, the lies, the future, he chose the work. He chose the one language we both spoke fluently. "Yes," I said. "A pearl essence glaze. Just 2 microns thick. If you go thicker, it muddies the color. If you go thinner, it disappears." Robert nodded slowly. He looked at my hands resting on my knees, hands that were stained with grease that no amount of hospital soap could scrub away. "I tried to paint once," he said, his voice wistful. "Before the business took me. I understood light. But I never understood structure. I could make things look pretty, but I could not make them work. You understand how things work, James. You fix what is broken." He was not talking about cars anymore. I wanted to say something, but my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a jarring sound in the quiet room. I pulled it out. It was Tony, the head mechanic at Iron and Dust. I stepped into the hallway to answer. The air out there was cold or sterile. James, Tony's voice was a harsh whisper. "You need to tell me what is going on. Right now." "I am at the hospital, Tony. My mom is bad." "No man listened to me," Tony hissed. "There is a guy here, at the shop. He pulled up in a yellow Lamborghini that looks like a spaceship. He is wearing a suit that shines. He says his name is Eric Sterling." My grip on the phone tightened until the plastic creaked. "Eric. What does he want?" I asked, my voice dropping to a growl. "He is asking questions, James. And he is flashing cash. A lot of cash. He is offering $5,000 to anyone who can tell him if you drink on the job, if you steal parts, if you have a record. He is digging for dirt, James. He is trying to buy a story." I felt a heat rise up my neck that had nothing to do with the hospital heating system. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Eric was not just protecting his inheritance. He was trying to destroy my character before I even had a chance to speak. "Tell him to get the hell off my floor, Tony," I said. "Tell him if he is not there for an oil change, he is trespassing." "I told him," Tony said. He laughed. He left a card. He said if anyone remembers anything interesting about you, there is $10,000 in it for them. Watch your back, kid. These people play dirty. I hung up. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the white tiles of the floor. I wanted to go back to the shop and smash Eric's teeth in, but I knew that was exactly what they wanted. They wanted the angry, violent mechanic. They wanted the thug. I took a deep breath, composed my face, and walked back into the room. But the peace had already been shattered. The door to the suite swung open, not with the quiet efficiency of a nurse, but with the entitlement of an owner. Victoria Sterling stood there. She was a striking woman, I had to give her that. But it was a manufactured beauty. Her skin was pulled too tight around her eyes, her lips were a little too full, and her blonde hair was coiffed into a helmet of perfection that defied gravity. She was wearing a white fur coat that probably cost more than the entire medical equipment in the room. Diamonds glittered at her throat, and ears cold and sharp like ice. She did not look at me. She did not look at Robert. Her eyes went straight to the bed. She looked at my dying mother with an expression of mingled curiosity and revulsion, like she was inspecting a stain on a silk dress. "Robert," she said. Her voice was like syrup laced with arsenic. The press is downstairs. They are saying the most ridiculous things. You really must come home. This charity case is becoming a spectacle." Robert did not stand up. He did not even turn around. He kept peeling the apple. "She is not a charity case, Victoria," Robert said calmly. Victoria stepped into the room. The scent of her perfume, something heavy and floral, instantly overpowered the smell of the lilies. It made me gag. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving a gloved hand. "Look at this place. Look at her. She looks used up. Is this the woman? The great love of the century? She looks like a maid I fired last week. That was it." I did not think. I moved. I stepped between Victoria and the bed, my body forming a wall. I stood to my full height. I am not a small man. Years of lifting engine blocks and wrestling with rusted bolts have given me shoulders that fill a doorway. I looked down at her. "Get out," I said. Victoria looked up at me. For a second, she looked surprised that the furniture was speaking to her. Then her eyes narrowed into slits. "Excuse me," she said, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "You must be the mechanic, the long-lost son. I can see the resemblance. You have the same grime as your mother." I took a step toward her. I did not raise my hand, but the menace in my posture was unmistakable. "I said get out," I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. "You are not welcome here. If you say one more word about my mother, I will carry you out of here myself, and I will not be gentle about it." Victoria gasped. She looked past me to her husband. "Robert, are you going to let this street trash threaten me?" Robert stopped peeling the apple. He set the knife down on the bedside table with a deliberate click. He stood up. When he turned to face her, the transformation was terrifying. The broken, weeping old man from the garage was gone. In his place stood the Titan, the man who had built an empire from steel and blood. His posture straightened, his jaw set. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "He is not street trash, Victoria," Robert said. His voice was not loud, but it thundered in the small room. "He is my son." Victoria's face paled beneath her makeup. "Robert, and you." Robert continued walking slowly toward her, forcing her to back up toward the door. "You are a leech. I tolerated you because I was dead inside. I let you spend my money. I let you raise that parasite Eric in my house because I felt nothing. But I am not dead anymore." He stopped inches from her face. "Go home, Victoria. Pack your bags. And tell Eric to start looking for a job. I am calling my lawyers in the morning." Victoria's eyes went wide. You can't mean I am rewriting the will," Robert said. "Every single sentence of it. Now get out of my sight before I have security throw you out like the garbage you are." Victoria stared at him for a heartbeat, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She realized, perhaps for the first time in her life, that her act was over. The checkbook was closed. She spun around her fur coat, whipping the air, and stormed out. She slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was vibrating with adrenaline. Robert let out a long, shaky breath and leaned against the wall. He looked old again. "I am sorry, James," he said, rubbing his eyes. "You should not have had to hear that." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had just dismantled his entire life in 30 seconds to defend a woman who couldn't even hear him. "You do not have to apologize," I said. But the war had only just begun. As I sat back down, watching my mother's chest rise and fall, I knew that people like Victoria and Eric did not just go away. They did not pack their bags and leave. They fought, and they fought dirty. Across town, in the back of a limousine speeding away from the hospital, Victoria was already on the phone. She was not calling a moving company. She was calling Eric. And Eric, furious and humiliated after being thrown out of my garage by my loyal friends, was making a call of his own. He was dialing the number of a man named Fletcher, a lawyer who was known in the dark alleys of Chicago, not for winning cases, but for burying problems. "I need him gone," Eric would be saying into the phone, his voice shaking with rage. I don't care how. I don't care what it costs. The mechanic, the mother, the old man, all of them. Remove the obstacles. I did not hear those words then, but as I held my mother's hand, I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside. It was the cold shadow of a predator circling, waiting for the moment to strike. I tried to go back to work the next morning. I needed the noise. I needed the familiar screech of pneumatic drills and the smell of industrial solvent to scrub the hospital scent from my skin. I needed to believe that my life had not completely spun off its axis. But the moment I stepped onto the concrete floor of iron and dust, I knew the sanctuary was gone. The shop was quiet. Too quiet. Usually by 8 in the morning the air would be thick with classic rock radio and the banter of mechanics. Today, the radio was off. My co-workers, men I had shared beers and pizzas with for a decade, stopped talking when I walked in. They looked at their boots. They looked at the ceiling. They looked everywhere but at me. I walked to my station, my toolbox feeling heavier than usual. Tony the foreman walked over. He did not look me in the eye. He just pointed to a stack of work orders on the bench. He mumbled that I should stick to the brake jobs today. No high-end restorations, no client interactions, just the grunt work. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. They had read the papers. They had seen the news. To them, I was no longer James the mechanic. I was a scandal. I was a lottery ticket that had been printed incorrectly. I put my head down and worked. I focused on the rhythmic turning of a wrench, trying to drown out the whispers. But I could feel the eyes on my back. I could feel the suspicion. Then, at 10:30 in the morning, the illusion of normalcy shattered completely. The bay doors flew open with a violence that made the metal tracks scream. It was not a customer. It was a raid. 6 uniformed officers and 2 detectives in cheap suits stormed into the garage. Their hands were on their holsters. Their faces were hard. "James Martinez!" one of the detectives shouted. His voice echoed off the steel beams. I stood up, wiping my grease-stained hands on a rag. "I am right here." Before I could take a step, they were on me. I was spun around and slammed against the fender of a Ford Mustang. The cold steel bit into my cheek. My arms were wrenched behind my back so hard, I felt a tendon pop in my shoulder. "You are under arrest," the detective growled in my ear. "For what?" I yelled, struggling against the handcuffs. "I have not done anything." "We have an anonymous tip regarding stolen property," the detective said. He signaled to 2 uniformed officers. "Check his locker, now." I watched helpless as they marched over to the row of metal lockers against the back wall. They knew exactly which one was mine. They did not even ask for the combination. They used a bolt cutter to snap the padlock. They pulled out my spare coveralls. They pulled out my boots. And then from the bottom shelf underneath a stack of old car magazines, they pulled out a black velvet drawstring bag. I had never seen that bag in my life. The officer dumped the contents onto the workbench. A collective gasp went through the shop. It was a fuel injection control unit for a Bugatti Chiron. It was a piece of technology worth $40,000 on the black market. I stared at it, my mouth open. "That is not mine," I shouted. "I have never worked on a Bugatti. We do not even service those cars here." "Save it for the precinct," the detective said. He tightened the cuffs until they cut into my wrists. "You are looking at grand larceny, kid. And with the value of that part, you are looking at 10 to 15 years. They dragged me out of the shop. I saw Tony watching me, his face pale. I saw the other mechanics shaking their heads. They believed it. The evidence was right there. They thought I was a thief. They thought I had used my connection to Robert Sterling to steal parts from high-end clients. Outside, the press was already waiting. It was a coordinated ambush. As the police shoved me into the back of the squad car, flashbulbs exploded in my face like lightning strikes. I could hear the reporters shouting questions. "Is it true you stole from your father's clients? Did you try to extort Robert Sterling? Are you a con artist, James? I ducked my head, burning with a shame so hot it felt like my skin was peeling off. The headline was writing itself in my mind. The billionaire's bastard is a professional thief. The holding cell at the precinct smelled of urine, old sweat, and bleach. It was a cage of concrete and steel filled with men who had nothing left to lose. When the guard shoved me in, the heavy door clanged shut with a sound of finality that made my blood run cold. I sat on the metal bench, hugging my knees. I was still wearing my work clothes. The grease on my shirt marked me. There were 3 other men in the cell. 2 of them were asleep in the corner, or pretending to be. The third one was sitting directly across from me. He was huge, with a shaved head and tattoos crawling up his neck. He was staring at me with a predatory intensity. He stood up slowly. He cracked his knuckles. "You are the mechanic, right?" he asked. His voice was gravel. "The Sterling kid." I did not answer. I looked at the floor. He took a step closer. "A little bird told me you like to steal things that do not belong to you." I stood up, my fists clenching. "I did not steal anything. It was a setup." He laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Yeah, everything is a setup. But see, the thing is, someone paid a lot of money to make sure you have a bad day in here. A lot of money." He didn't wait for a response. He swung. His fist connected with my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. I heard the crack before I felt the pain. I doubled over, gasping for air. He brought his knee up into my face. My nose exploded in a spray of blood. I fell to the cold concrete floor. He kicked me in the stomach, then in the back. I curled into a ball, trying to protect my head. This was not a fight. It was an execution. It was a message. "Regards from Eric," he whispered as he landed a final kick to my kidney. I lay there on the floor, tasting copper and dust, listening to the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. I could not breathe. Pain radiated from every inch of my body. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the realization that hit me. Eric Sterling did not just want to ruin my reputation. He wanted to break me. He wanted me dead. Meanwhile, across the city, the poison was spreading. In the VIP suite at the hospital, my mother was awake. A well-meaning but foolish nurse had turned on the television mounted on the wall. The volume was low, but the banner at the bottom of the screen was screaming in bright red letters. "Breaking news. Illegitimate son of Robert Sterling arrested for grand larceny. Police raid finds stolen supercar parts." My mother saw my face on the screen. The mugshot they had taken 20 minutes ago, my face bloody and swollen. She saw the headlines calling me a thief, a criminal, a fraud. Her heart, already weakened by decades of struggle, and the shock of Robert's return, could not take it. The stress flooded her system like acid. The monitor began to shriek. Her numbers plummeted. Nurses rushed in. Code blue. The room became a chaotic storm of defibrillators and epinephrine, but the damage was done. The lie had pierced her heart as surely as a bullet. Robert was at his mansion when he got the call. He was meeting with his lawyers, trying to draft the new will. When his phone rang, he answered it with a growl, annoyed at the interruption. Then his face went gray. He stood up, knocking his chair over. He did not grab his cane. He did not call for his driver. He grabbed his coat and ran out the door, moving with a speed that defied his age and his health. He did not go to the hospital. He knew the doctors were doing everything they could for Maria. He went to the place where he could fight. He went to the police precinct. I was lying on the cot in the cell, trying to stop the bleeding from my nose with a wad of toilet paper, when the guard came back. He looked pale, nervous. "Get up, Martinez," he said. "You made bail." I limped out of the cell. My ribs screamed with every step. My left eye was swollen shut. I looked like a monster. When I walked into the booking area, the room went silent. Robert Sterling was standing there. He was surrounded by a phalanx of high-priced lawyers in Italian suits. The precinct captain was standing in front of him, looking like a schoolboy who had been caught cheating. "My son walks out of here right now," Robert was saying. His voice was low, but it carried a weight that made the walls tremble. Or I will have every badge number in this room investigated by the finest private detectives money can buy. I will sue this city until it is bankrupt, the captain stammered. Mr. Sterling, the evidence is planted, Robert cut him off. A blind man could see it. My son restores cars worth millions. Why would he steal a $40,000 part? It is an insult to his intelligence and to mine. He turned and saw me. He saw the blood. He saw the bruising. He saw the way I was holding my side. For a moment I thought he was going to collapse. His face crumpled in horror. He rushed past the captain and grabbed me by the shoulders. His hands were gentle ghosts, touching a wound. "Who did this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "Who touched him?" I looked at him through my one good eye. I saw the fear in his face. I saw the love. "It does not matter," I mumbled. "Just get me out of here." He put his arm around me, supporting my weight. He turned to the captain. "If anything happens to the footage from the holding cell cameras," Robert said, his voice like ice, "I will destroy you." We walked out of the precinct together, the father and the son, the billionaire and the convict. The steps of the station were a sea of reporters. Microphones were thrust in our faces. Cameras shuddered like machine gun fire. "Mr. Sterling, is your son a thief? James, did you steal the part? Robert, are you going to cut him off?" Robert stopped. He raised his hand. The crowd went silent. The authority he commanded was absolute. He stepped up to the microphones. He did not let go of me. He pulled me closer, displaying my battered face to the world. "Look at this," Robert said. He pointed to my injuries. "This is not justice. This is a hit job. This is fear." He looked directly into the camera lens. He was speaking to the world, but I knew he was speaking to Victoria and Eric. "I have spent 30 years building an empire," Robert said. "I have built skyscrapers. I have built cities. But today I am telling you that none of it matters more than the man standing next to me." He paused, his grip on my shoulder tightening. "I trust my son James Martinez more than any of you. I trust him more than the board members of my company. I trust him more than the people living in my own house. And if anyone thinks they can hurt him to get to me, they are making a fatal mistake. You have not seen a war until you have seen a father fighting for his child." The crowd erupted. It was the sound bite of the century. We got into the waiting limousine. As the door closed, shutting out the noise and the lights, Robert slumped back against the seat. His energy was gone. He looked gray, exhausted. He was running on fumes. "We are going to the hospital," he whispered. "Maria had an episode." I felt the blood drain from my face, but the war was fought on two fronts. While we raced to the hospital, Victoria Sterling was holding her own press conference on the steps of the Sterling Manor. She was dressed in black, looking somber and concerned. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. "It is a tragedy," she told the cameras, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "My husband, poor Robert. He is not himself. We have been worried about his cognitive decline for months. He is confused. He is vulnerable. And now these people have taken advantage of him. This young man, this criminal, and his mother have manipulated a sick old man. It is elder abuse, pure and simple. We are just trying to protect him." She looked straight into the camera, her eyes hard as diamonds. "We will not let them destroy this family," she said. I watched the clip on my phone as the limo sped through the snow. I looked at my father, sleeping fitfully next to me. I touched my swollen face. I realized then that Robert's world was not a fairy tale of wealth and ease. It was a shark tank. It was a battlefield where truth was irrelevant and money was the only ammunition. I had walked into a trap, and I had dragged my mother right in with me. Eric had planted the part. Victoria was spinning the narrative. They were squeezing us from both sides. I looked out at the frozen city. I felt a cold resolve settle in my gut, harder than the steel of the handcuffs I had just worn. They thought I was just a mechanic. They thought I was weak. They were wrong. I fix things. That is what I do. And I was going to fix this, even if I had to dismantle their entire world, bolt by bolt, to do it. The days that followed my release from jail were a blur of gray skies and a creeping, insidious dread. The adrenaline of the police station confrontation had faded, replaced by a cold reality. My father, the invincible Iron Lord, was dying, and it was happening faster than nature intended. I saw it in the way his skin took on a translucent, waxy quality, like parchment, stretched too thin over bone. I saw it in the tremors that shook his hands, tremors that were violent and rhythmic, unlike the palsy of old age. He complained constantly of a metallic taste in his mouth, claiming that the water in the mansion tasted like copper pennies. He told me he had stopped eating the meals the kitchen staff prepared, claiming no appetite, but I noticed he would greedily eat the sandwiches I brought him from the deli near my shop. I had my suspicions. They were dark, terrible suspicions that I could not voice without proof. Every time I looked at Victoria with her cold smile and her watchful eyes, I wondered what she was putting in his evening tea. But I was powerless. I was the outsider, the mechanic's son with a criminal record, and she was the grieving wife of a national icon. 3 days after the press conference, Robert called me at 2 a.m. His voice was strong, surprisingly so, as if he had summoned every last ounce of his remaining vitality for this one conversation. "Meet me at the South Loop warehouse," he said. "Come alone. Tell no one." I drove through the sleeping city, the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. The South Loop warehouse was an unremarkable brick building in a district of abandoned factories. It did not look like it belonged to a billionaire. It looked like a tomb. When I rolled up the heavy metal door, I found Robert sitting on a wooden crate. He was dressed not in his usual Italian suit, but in a pair of oil-stained coveralls that looked 3 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. Behind him, under dusty canvas tarps, sat the shapes of cars. He stood up as I entered. He waved his hand at the space. "This is where it started, James," he said. "Before the skyscrapers. Before the empire. This was my first shop." He pulled the tarp off the nearest vehicle. It was not a Rolls-Royce or a Ferrari. It was a 1948 Ford F1 pickup truck. It was painted a dull primer gray, and the engine lay in pieces on a workbench next to it. "I bought this truck for $50 when I was 20 years old," he said, running a hand over the fender. "I want to hear it run again." For the next 4 hours, we did not talk about lawyers, or wills, or the sharks circling us. We talked about torque specs and firing orders. We rebuilt the carburetor. We gapped the spark plugs. I watched my father's hands, clumsy now, but remembering the movements of his youth, turning wrenches with a determination that broke my heart. As we tightened the manifold bolts, Robert stopped. He leaned against the fender, breathing hard sweat beading on his forehead. "Business is not about money, James," he said, looking at the engine block. "People think it is about the cash flow, the profit margins, the paint job. It is not. It is about the structure." He tapped the chassis of the truck with a wrench. "This frame," he said. "If the frame is bent, the car will never drive straight. It does not matter if you put a gold engine in it. It does not matter if you upholster the seats in silk. If the structural integrity is compromised, the machine fails. My company, the Sterling Empire, the frame is bent, James. It is rotten with greed. I built a beautiful body on a broken chassis." He reached into the pocket of his coveralls and pulled out a small object. He took my hand, his palm, rough and hot, and pressed the object into mine. It was a key. It was made of heavy brass, old and tarnished with a complicated antique bit. It did not look like a key to a door or a car. It looked like something from another century. "Keep this," he whispered. "Do not lose it. Do not tell anyone you have it." "What is it for?" I asked, turning the cold metal over in my fingers. "Structure," he said enigmatically. "It is the blueprint. When the walls fall down, James, and they will fall down, you go back to the foundation. This key leads to the foundation." He would say no more about it. We finished the truck as the sun began to bleed through the high windows of the warehouse. When I turned the key in the ignition, The old Ford roared to life, coughing smoke, before settling into a steady, rhythmic idle. Robert smiled. It was the most genuine smile I had seen on his face since the day he found me. But the moment of victory was short-lived. My phone rang. It was the hospital. We did not even change out of our coveralls. We drove to the hospital in silence, the sense of impending doom sitting heavy in the car between us. When we arrived, the nurses stepped aside. The room was quiet. The machines had been silenced. My mother was lying there, her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. She looked incredibly young, the pain and the years smoothed away by the final fading of the light. She turned her head as we entered. She smiled. It was a weak, fluttering thing. "My two mechanics," she whispered. I went to one side of the bed, Robert to the other. We each took a hand. Her skin was cool, like paper left out in the winter air. "Robert," she said, her voice barely audible. "You are late. I was fixing a truck, Maria," he said, tears streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the grease on his cheeks. "Just like the old days." She squeezed his hand. "It is okay," she said. "I am not afraid. The fire cannot hurt me anymore." Then she looked at me. "Be good, James. Be strong. Do not let the world make you hard. Promise me." "I promise, Mom," I choked out, burying my face in her hand. She took a breath, then another, and then there were no more breaths. The room seemed to contract, the world becoming smaller and darker in an instant. Robert let out a sound that I will never forget. It was not a scream. It was a low animal moan of absolute devastation. He slumped over her body, burying his face in her neck, sobbing with the force of a man who has lost his soul twice. I stood there, holding her cooling hand, and felt a piece of myself die with her. But I could not collapse. I had to be the frame. I had to be the structure. The funeral took place 2 days later. It was a small, bleak affair at a cemetery on the outskirts of the city, far away from the Sterling family crypt. The sky was the color of a bruise, and the wind whipped the snow into our faces. There were only a handful of people there. Me, Robert, Tony, and the guys from the shop. A few neighbors from the tenement building. Robert stood by the grave, leaning heavily on me. He looked like a dead man walking. His eyes were vacant, staring into the dark earth, where the only woman he had ever loved was being lowered. As the priest finished the final prayer, a black van pulled up to the cemetery gates. A delivery man in a uniform hopped out, carrying a massive, ostentatious wreath of white lilies. He walked right up to the graveside, oblivious to the solemnity of the moment. "Delivery for the Martinez funeral," he announced loud enough for everyone to hear. I stepped forward. "Who is it from?" The man handed me a card. I opened it. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and unmistakable. It was Victoria's, to Maria. "A regrettable chapter is finally closed. May you find the peace in death that you could not afford in life." The Sterling family. Rage, white-hot and blinding, exploded in my chest. It was a calculated insult. A final spit in the face of the woman they had destroyed. I looked at the wreath. I looked at the delivery man. I took my Zippo lighter out of my pocket. "James," Robert said, his voice confused. I did not answer. I flicked the lighter open. The flame danced in the wind. I touched it to the dry ribbons of the wreath. The silk and plastic caught fire instantly. The flames roared up bright orange against the gray snow. The delivery man stumbled back in shock. I stood there watching the flowers burn, watching the insult turn to ash. The heat seared my face, but I did not blink. "Tell Mrs. Sterling," I said to the terrified delivery man, "that we do not accept her trash." As the last of the wreath crumbled into black soot, I felt a heavy weight hit my shoulder. I turned just in time to catch Robert. His eyes had rolled back in his head. His mouth was slack. He collapsed into my arms, dead weight. "Dad!" I screamed. "Call an ambulance." The next few hours were a nightmare of sirens and waiting rooms. This time, it was not the quiet VIP wing. It was the emergency trauma center. The doctors told me it was a massive stroke. His heart, already weak, had given out under the grief. He was in a coma. They did not know if he would wake up. I sat in the waiting room, still smelling of smoke from the cemetery, my hands covered in cemetery mud. I was waiting for news. Instead, I got security. 4 large men in tactical gear walked into the waiting room. They were not hospital security. They were private contractors. On their uniforms, they wore the Sterling security insignia. "James Martinez?" the lead guard asked. "Yes," I stood up. "You need to leave," he said. "What?" "My father is in there. Mr. Sterling is under the care of his wife and legal guardian Victoria Sterling." The guard said, his voice robotic. "She has issued a no trespass order for you. You are barred from the premises. If you do not leave voluntarily, we are authorized to remove you." I looked at the doors to the trauma unit. I wanted to fight. I wanted to tear through them. But I saw the hands of the guards resting on their tasers. I saw the hospital staff watching fearfully. A fight here would only get me arrested again, and I could not help my father from a jail cell. I left. I walked out into the cold, empty night. I called Robert's lawyer, a man named Arthur Thorne, who had been working on the new will. The phone rang 4 times. Mr. Martinez Thorne's voice was clipped, nervous. "Mr. Thorne, my father is in a coma. They kicked me out. We need the new will. The one he drafted last week. The one that names me as his medical proxy." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I am afraid you are mistaken," Mr. Martinez Thorne said. "There is no new will." My heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" "We met. He signed it." "I saw him sign it." "I have reviewed the files," Thorne said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The only valid will on record is dated 1995. It leaves the entirety of the estate and all decision-making powers to Victoria Sterling. Any drafts you might have seen were never notarized. They are not legal documents." I understood then. The tentacles of the Sterling money reached everywhere, even to the sworn officers of the court. Eric had gotten to him, whether it was a bribe or a threat Thorne had flipped. "But the drafts," I shouted. "You have copies." "I have nothing," Mr. Martinez Thorne said. "Do not call this office again." The line went dead. I stood on the sidewalk, the snow soaking through my thin funeral shoes. My mother was dead. My father was dying behind a wall of security I could not breach. My reputation was in tatters. The legal protection Robert had tried to build for me had vanished into thin air. I had nothing. No money. No allies. No power. I reached into my pocket. My fingers closed around the cold, jagged shape of the brass key. "Structure," he had said. "Go back to the foundation." I pulled the key out and looked at it under the street lamp. It was just a piece of metal. It looked worthless. But it was the only thing they had not taken from me. I gripped it until the edges bit into my palm. They thought they had won. They thought they had buried me along with my mother. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that you do not need a whole car to start an engine. You just need a spark. And I was burning. The city of Chicago did not stop for Robert Sterling's death. The trains still ran on the elevated tracks, the wind still cut through the streets, and the relentless machinery of commerce kept grinding. But for me, the world had come to a complete, shuddering halt. I did not receive a phone call. I did not get a letter from a lawyer. I found out that my father was dead while sitting on a plastic stool at a 24-hour diner on the South Side, eating a plate of cold eggs. It was 3 a.m. The television mounted in the corner of the diner, usually tuned to sports highlights, suddenly cut to a breaking news banner. The screen turned black, and then a portrait of Robert appeared. It was a photo from 10 years ago, when he was at the height of his power, looking like a king in a tailored suit. The caption read, "Robert Sterling, real estate tycoon and philanthropist, dead at 68. I dropped my fork. It clattered against the ceramic plate, the sound loud in the empty diner. The news anchor, a woman with perfect hair and zero empathy, read the statement released by the family. She said that Robert Sterling had passed away peacefully in his sleep at his historic Gold Coast mansion, surrounded by his loving wife and son. I felt a scream build in my throat, but it died there, choked off by a crushing weight of helplessness. Surrounded by his loving family. It was a lie. A final, polished, expensive lie. He had died alone in a room full of medical equipment guarded by men, paid to keep his only real family away. He had died while I was sitting 10 miles away, staring at a phone that never rang. I paid for my meal with crumbling bills, walked out into the night, and sat in my truck. I did not cry. I think I had run out of tears when I watched my mother's coffin go into the ground. Instead, I felt a cold, hollow emptiness, as if my insides had been scooped out and replaced with lead. The funeral was held 4 days later. It was not a service. It was a coronation for the dead. They held it at the Holy Name Cathedral. The streets were blocked off for 6 blocks. Black limousines stretched as far as the eye could see, shining like beetles in the drizzle. The sidewalks were packed with onlookers, tourists, and employees of the Sterling Group, all craning their necks to see the arrival of the elite. I was not on the guest list. I parked my rusted pickup truck 5 blocks away in an alley. I put on the only suit I owned, the same cheap black suit I had worn to bury my mother less than a week ago. It still smelled faintly of the smoke from the burning wreath. It was wrinkled, and the cuffs were fraying slightly, but I brushed it off as best I could. I was not going there to make a scene. I was going there because I had to say goodbye. I had to be near him one last time, even if it was from the shadows. I slipped past the police barricades by blending in with a group of catering staff, entering through a side door. I made my way into the massive, cavernous sanctuary of the cathedral. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly cold. The air smelled of incense and money. Hundreds of people filled the pews. Senators, business rivals, celebrities, people who had probably hated Robert while he was alive, but were now desperate to be seen mourning him. At the front, near the altar, sat the closed casket. It was mahogany, polished to a mirror, shine-draped in white roses. And there, in the front row, sat the widow and the heir. Victoria was a study in theatrical grief. She wore a black veil that was sheer enough to show her tear-stained face, but thick enough to hide her triumphant eyes. Eric sat next to her, looking bored, checking his watch every few minutes. He looked like a man waiting for a disbursement check, not a son mourning a father. I stood in the very back, hidden behind a marble pillar, in the shadows of the nave. I just wanted to watch the service. I wanted to hear the prayers. But Eric, ever the predator, was scanning the room. He was not looking for friends. He was looking for threats. His eyes swept over the crowd, past the senators, past the cameras, and then they stopped. They locked onto the shadows in the back. He saw me. I saw him stiffen. He leaned over and whispered something to the head of security, a man with a scar running down his neck. He pointed a finger directly at the pillar where I stood. The security chief nodded and tapped his earpiece. I saw 4 men in suits detach themselves from the walls and start moving toward me. They moved with the purpose of sharks scenting blood. I did not run. There was nowhere to go. They reached me just as the priest began the opening homily. They did not ask me to leave. They grabbed me. One man seized my left arm, twisting it behind my back. Another grabbed my collar. "Get off me," I whispered, trying to keep my voice down. "I am just paying my respects." Mr. Sterling gave strict orders, the guard hissed in my ear. "No trash allowed." They dragged me. They did not walk me out. They physically dragged me down the side aisle. The commotion caused heads to turn. A ripple of murmurs went through the cathedral. The cameras, hungry for drama, swiveled away from the coffin and pointed at the scuffle in the back. Eric turned in his seat. He looked right at me. He smiled. It was a small, cruel twitch of his lips that said, "I won." Victoria stood up then. She walked to the podium to give her eulogy, timing it perfectly with my expulsion. My husband was a man of family, she said, her voice amplified by the speakers booming through the hall. He believed in tradition. He believed in the purity of the Sterling name. He would have wanted us to protect his legacy from those who seek to tarnish it. As she spoke, the words, "Tarnish it," the guards shoved me through the heavy oak doors of the cathedral. We tumbled down the stone steps. It had been raining all morning, and the bottom of the steps was a slurry of mud and oil from the waiting cars. They threw me. I hit the pavement hard. My hands skidded across the wet asphalt, scraping the skin off my palms. The mud soaked instantly into my suit, ruining the only formal clothes I owned. A flash of lightning, camera flashes, exploded around me. The paparazzi outside had found their story. The outcast son thrown into the gutter. "Stay out," one of the guards spat, adjusting his tie. "Next time we break your legs." The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing the warmth and the light inside, leaving me in the cold rain. I lay there for a moment. I could feel the grit of the street against my cheek. I could hear the clicks of the cameras capturing my humiliation. I could imagine Eric laughing. I could imagine Victoria's self-righteous face. Violence surged in my blood. I wanted to get up, grab a tire iron from my truck, and shatter those oak doors. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn it all down. But then I remembered the warehouse. I remembered my father's hands on the engine of the old Ford. "Structure, James. It is about the structure. If I fought them now on their terms, I was just the street thug they claimed I was. If I threw a punch, I proved them right." I pushed myself up. I did not wipe the mud off my face. I did not yell at the guards. I stood up slowly, fighting the trembling in my legs. I straightened my jacket. I fixed my collar. I looked at the closed doors of the cathedral. I looked at the security cameras. I looked at the paparazzi, and I stared. I did not scowl. I did not cry. I looked at that church with a cold, terrifying clarity. I etched the image of those doors into my mind. They had thrown me out of the house of God, but they could not throw me out of the war. I turned my back on the funeral and walked away. I walked 5 miles in the rain back to my apartment, the water soaking me to the bone, washing away the shock, and leaving only a diamond-hard resolve. Back in my small, empty apartment, the silence was deafening. My mother's knitting basket still sat by her chair. The air still smelled faintly of her lavender soap. I stripped off the ruined suit and threw it in the trash. I took a hot shower, scrubbing the mud from my skin until I was raw. Then, I sat at my small kitchen table. I reached into the pocket of my jeans and pulled out the brass key. It was heavy, cool to the touch. I turned on the overhead lamp and held the key under the harsh light. When everything collapses, find the source. I examined the key closely. It was an old skeleton key, the kind used for heavy mortise locks in the 1920s. The bow of the key was intricate, shaped like a lion's head. But it was the shaft of the key that caught my eye. There were scratches on it. They looked random at first, just wear and tear. But as I rotated the key, the light caught them at a certain angle. They were not scratches. They were engravings. Tiny, microscopic numbers etched into the brass with a jeweler's precision. I grabbed a magnifying glass from my junk drawer, one I used for inspecting circuit boards. I peered through the glass. The numbers jumped out at me. 41.886, 87.624. Coordinates. I pulled out my phone and typed them into the map application. The red pin dropped onto a location in downtown Chicago. It was not the Sterling Tower, the glass monolith that served as the current headquarters. It was an address 3 blocks away, the old Sterling Building. It was the first building my grandfather had bought, a heavy 12-story brick structure built in 1925. It had been abandoned for years, slated for demolition to make way for a new parking garage. It was a ghost building, the source. I looked at the clock. It was 7 in the evening. The funeral reception would be starting now. Victoria and Eric would be drinking champagne and toasting their victory. They would be distracted. I grabbed my tool bag. I packed a lockpick, set a high-lumen tactical flashlight, a pry bar, and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. I put on my dark work coveralls and a black beanie. I was not James the heir tonight. I was James the mechanic, and I was going to work. The old Sterling Building was surrounded by a chain-link fence, topped with razor wire. I parked my truck 2 alleys over. I cut through the fence in a blind spot behind a dumpster. The building loomed above me, dark and silent. The windows were boarded up. The front entrance was welded shut. But my father had taught me about structure. Every building has a weakness. Every fortress has a drain. I found the coal chute in the back alley. It was rusted shut, welded by time and corrosion. I used the pry bar, leveraging my weight against the iron. It groaned, protested, and then snapped open with a shower of rust flakes. I slid down the chute into the darkness. I landed on a pile of coal dust in the basement. The air was thick, stale, smelling of rot and century-old dampness. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the dust motes. I was in the boiler room. Huge, rusted furnaces sat like sleeping dragons. I navigated through the maze of pipes, following the layout I had memorized from the building's old blueprints I had found online on the way over. I needed the sub-basement. I found a heavy steel door marked Archives. It was locked, but the lock was simple. A standard pin tumbler. I had it open in 30 seconds. The stairs went down, deeper into the earth. The air got colder. At the bottom of the stairs there was a corridor lined with empty shelves. At the end of the corridor was a wall. Just a brick wall. I stopped. I checked the map on my phone. The GPS signal was weak, but the blue dot hovered right over me. This was the spot. I ran my hand over the bricks. They were cold, slimy. Find the source. I looked at the floor. The dust was thick, undisturbed for decades. But there, near the base of the wall, there was a scratch. A semicircle in the concrete floor, as if something heavy had dragged across it. I looked at the wall again. One brick at waist height was slightly cleaner than the others. It had a small indentation in the center. I took out the brass key. I inserted it into the indentation. It went in smoothly. I turned it. There was a heavy thunk of a hidden mechanism releasing. A section of the brick wall, concealed on a pivot hinge, swung inward. My heart hammered against my ribs. I shone the light inside. It was a vault. A small concrete room, no bigger than a closet. And in the center of the room stood a safe. It was a monstrosity. A Mosler cannonball safe from the 1900s, round and impenetrable, made of solid manganese steel. It looked like it could survive a nuclear blast. There was no keyhole, just a massive numbered dial. I approached it. My breath fogged in the cold air. I needed a combination. I closed my eyes. My father had left me a key to get here, but he hadn't given me the code. He trusted me to figure it out. He knew how my mind worked. Structure, foundation, family. The numbers on the dial went from 0 to 100. I thought about the dates. My birthday? August 12th, 1991. My mother's birthday? No. The day he met her. I didn't know it. Then I remembered the car ride, the story he told me, the tattoo. I designed that tattoo for her 35 years ago. He had designed the tattoo, the symbol of their pact, the symbol that was on my wrist. And then I was born, the result of that pact. The code had to be the timeline of us, the creation of the symbol, and the creation of the sun. I did the math in my head. The year was 1990 when he drew the tattoo. The date? He said it was the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. June 21st, 6, 21, 90. And my birthday, August 12th, 8, 12. I put my hand on the cold steel dial. I spun it to the left, 6. I spun it to the right, 21. Left again, 90. Right, 8. Left, 12. I held my breath. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled. Click. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the silence. The heavy round door swung open on effortless, well-oiled hinges. I shone the light inside. The safe was not filled with stacks of cash. It was not filled with gold bars or diamonds. It contained a single, thick accordion folder made of leather and a small silver USB drive taped to the front of it. I reached in and took the folder. It was heavy. I opened it right there on the floor of the vault. The first document on top was a birth certificate. My birth certificate. But not the one my mother had shown me, which listed father unknown. This one listed the father clearly, Robert Sterling, and it was signed by him. He had acknowledged me the day I was born before the lies separated us. Beneath that were bank records, trust deeds, and a stack of papers with the heading, Operation Icarus, Evidence of Embezzlement and Fraud, Eric Sterling. I flipped through the pages. My hands started to shake. This was not just a will. This was a nuclear weapon. It was a detailed documented record of every illegal thing Eric and Victoria had done for the last 10 years to siphon money from the company. Shell companies' bribes, offshore accounts. Robert had known. He had been watching them. He had been compiling this file, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then, he ran out of time. I picked up the USB drive. On the back, in Robert's shaky handwriting, was a piece of masking tape with one word written on it. Truth. I closed the folder. I put the USB drive in my safest pocket. I stood up in the dark, damp basement of the building where the Sterling empire began. I was alone. I was poor. I was an outcast. But as I held that file against my chest, I knew one thing for certain. The funeral was over. The mourning was done. Tomorrow the dead would speak. And they would scream. The elevator ride to the penthouse floor of the Sterling Tower took exactly 45 seconds. I counted every single one of them. My ears popped as we ascended past the 40th floor, leaving the noise of the Chicago streets far below. I was wearing a clean pair of dark jeans and a fresh flannel shirt. I had refused to buy another suit. I was done playing dress-up. If they wanted to humiliate me, they would have to do it to the real me, not some costume version of myself. When the doors slid open with a soft chime, I stepped into a world that smelled of money and lemon polish. The boardroom was a massive aquarium of glass and steel, offering a panoramic view of the city my father had helped build. The room was packed. It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a public execution. Every seat at the mahogany table was taken. There were board members in navy suits, their faces tight and unreadable. There were lawyers, an army of them, billing by the minute. And in the back behind a velvet rope were the press. The cameras were already rolling their red recording lights, blinking like hungry eyes. At the head of the table sat the victors. Victoria Sterling was dressed in mourning black, but her jewelry told a different story. A necklace of sapphires the size of robin's eggs rested against her throat. She looked tragic and expensive. Next to her sat Eric. He was not even trying to look solemn. He was leaning back in his leather chair, his feet resting on the polished wood of the table, scrolling through his phone. When I walked in, he looked up and smirked. It was the smile of a man who had already spent the money in his head. There was one empty chair left. It was a folding metal chair placed comically far away from the main table near the door. A subtle reminder of my place. I ignored it. I walked to the back of the room and stood against the glass wall, crossing my arms. Arthur Thorne, the lawyer who had betrayed me, stood at the podium. He adjusted his glasses and tapped a stack of documents. He looked nervous. He kept glancing at Eric, sweating slightly, despite the aggressive air conditioning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thorne began, his voice wavering slightly, "we are gathered here to execute the last will and testament of Robert Sterling." He droned on for 20 minutes about charitable donations and minor bequests to staff. The room was silent, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. Everyone was waiting for the main event. Finally, Thorne cleared his throat. He turned a page. Regarding the primary estate, he read, including the controlling interest in Sterling Real Estate, all liquid assets, properties in the family trust. Robert Sterling leaves the entirety of his fortune to be divided equally between his beloved wife, Victoria Sterling, and his son, Eric Sterling. A collective exhale went through the room. The flashbulbs popped. Victoria dabbed at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. Eric pumped a fist in the air, a vulgar display of triumph that made a few of the older shareholders wince. Thorne held up a hand. "There is one final bequest." The room went deadly quiet. Eric took his feet off the table and leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. To James Martinez, Thorne read, avoiding my gaze. Mr. Sterling writes, I leave a reminder of where you came from. May you find contentment in the labor for which you are suited. Thorne reached under the podium and pulled out a heavy object. It was a toolbox. It was not a new one. It was an old, battered red metal box, rusted at the corners, covered in scratches and grease stains. It looked like something you would find in a dumpster behind a mechanic shop. Thorne walked over and placed it on the floor in the center of the room. That is it, Thorne said. That concludes the reading. For a second, there was silence. Then a titter of laughter started from the back of the room. It spread like a contagion. The lawyers chuckled. The press scribbled furiously. Even some of the board members smirked. It was the ultimate insult. The billionaire father telling his bastard son that he was worth nothing more than a box of wrenches. Eric stood up. He walked over to the toolbox. He looked at me, his eyes full of hate. He kicked the box. It slid across the polished floor with a screech of metal on wood, stopping inches from my boots. Take it, Eric spat. Take your trash and get out of my building, you bastard. Go fix a toilet or something. You got exactly what you deserve. The laughter in the room grew louder. Victoria was smiling openly now, a cruel, satisfied twist of her lips. She looked at me with pity, the way one looks at a dying insect. I looked down at the box. I remembered the weight of the key in my pocket. I remembered the safe in the sub-basement. I remembered the look in my father's eyes when we fixed that truck. Structure James. I bent down. The laughter died down a little. They wanted to see me cry. They wanted to see me rage. They wanted a show. I picked up the toolbox. It was heavy. Heavier than it should have been if it were just tools. I set it on the end of the conference table. The sound of the metal hitting the expensive wood made Eric flinch. You are right, Eric, I said. My voice was calm, steady. It did not sound like the voice of a defeated man. I am a mechanic, and a mechanic knows that you always check your tools before you start a job. I unlatched the rusty clasps. Click, click. I threw the lid open. Inside, there were no wrenches. There were no screwdrivers. The box was filled with a block of black foam padding, and nestled in the center of the foam were two items: a digital voice recorder, and a thick document with a blue cover stamped with the gold seal of the Federal Supreme Court. I reached in and pulled out the document. I held it up. The light from the chandelier caught the gold foil of the seal. The laughter in the room stopped instantly. Arthur Thorne's face went white. He dropped his pen. "What is that?" Victoria demanded, her voice shrill. "That is not part of the bequest." "No," I said. "It is not. This is a durable power of attorney granting me, James Martinez, full legal authority over the medical and financial decisions of Robert Sterling." I walked toward the podium. Thorne stepped back as if I were radioactive, and I continued, my voice rising. "It is dated 4 days ago. It was notarized by Justice Holloway of the Supreme Court, a personal friend of my father. It supersedes any document you have, Mr. Thorne, especially the one you forged." "Lies!" Eric shouted. He was red in the face. He was in a coma. He couldn't sign anything. I ignored him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver USB drive I had retrieved from the vault. I turned to the man sitting at the far end of the table. Silas Vance. He was the oldest board member, a man who had built Chicago alongside my father. He had been watching the proceedings with a frown. "Mr. Vance," I said, "I have a presentation." "May I?" Thorne lunged forward. "No, this is highly irregular. Security, remove him. Let the boy speak." Silas Vance slammed his hand on the table. The sound cracked like a whip. "If Robert left him something, I want to see what it is. Plug it in." The room was paralyzed. The security guards looked from Eric to Silas, unsure of who held the real power. In that moment of hesitation, I walked to the laptop connected to the massive projector screen behind the podium. I plugged in the USB drive. A folder popped up on the screen. It was labeled "The Truth." I clicked the video file. The screen flickered and then a face appeared. It was Robert Sterling. He was sitting in the very warehouse where we had fixed the truck. He was wearing his oil-stained coveralls. He looked tired, his skin gray, but his eyes were sharp, lucid, and burning with a cold fire. He looked directly into the camera. "My name is Robert Sterling," the video Robert said. His voice boomed through the silent boardroom. "And if you are watching this, then I am dead. And the sharks are feeding," Victoria gasped. She put a hand to her throat. "Turn it off," she shrieked. "It is a deep fake. It is AI. Turn it off." Nobody moved. The press were zooming in on the screen. "I am recording this statement on January 20th, Robert continued on screen. "I am of sound mind, and I am here to confess my greatest mistake." On screen, Robert leaned forward. "For the last 5 years, I have been a prisoner in my own home. My wife, Victoria, and her son, Eric, have systematically isolated me. They have drugged my food to induce confusion. They have fired my loyal staff. They have forged my signature on loan documents to cover Eric's gambling debts and Victoria's embezzlement." A murmur of shock swept through the room. Shareholders were looking at Eric with horror. Eric was standing frozen, his mouth open. "I compiled the evidence," Robert said, holding up the thick accordion file I had found in the safe. "It is all here. The offshore accounts. The bribes paid to Arthur Thorne to alter my will." On screen, Robert paused. He took a deep breath. He looked sad. "But the money is not the worst lie," he said softly. He looked straight at the camera, which meant he was looking straight at Eric. "Eric," he said, "you have spent your whole life waiting for me to die so you could inherit my bloodline. You think you are the crown prince of Chicago." Robert shook his head. "But you cannot inherit what is not yours. You are not my son." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum. "Victoria lied to me," Robert continued. "She told me she was pregnant with my child to trap me into marriage. I believed her because I was grieving the woman I actually loved. But I ran a DNA test 3 days ago." Robert held up a piece of paper to the camera. It was a paternity test result. 0% probability, Robert read. "Your father was Victoria's personal trainer in 1995. You are not a Sterling Eric. You never were. And you will not see a single dime of my money." The video ended with Robert staring into the lens. "I leave everything, my company, my assets, my legacy, to my only biological son, James Martinez." The screen went black. For 3 seconds, nobody breathed. Then the room exploded. It was chaos. Reporters were shouting, jumping over chairs to get closer. Shareholders were yelling at Thorne. Victoria let out a scream that sounded like a tearing sheet. It was a primal animal noise. "You did this!" she shrieked. She lunged at me. She scrambled over the conference table, her expensive dress riding up her nails, clawing at the air. She looked insane. Her mask had completely shattered. "Security!" Silas Vance shouted, standing up. "Restrain that woman!" 2 guards grabbed Victoria before she could reach me. She was thrashing, spitting, screaming obscenities that would make a sailor blush. I stood still near the projector. I did not flinch. I watched her. Eric was slumped in his chair. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He was staring at the blank screen, his face a mask of shock. The arrogance was gone. The entitlement was gone. He was just a man who had found out he was nobody. I looked at the toolbox on the table, the rusty, beat-up box that they had laughed at. My father was right. It wasn't about the money. It was about the structure. And he had just used a rusty toolbox to bring the whole skyscraper crashing down on their heads. I picked up the remote and ejected the USB. I turned to Silas Vance. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice cutting through the noise, "I believe we have some business to discuss regarding the future of my company." Silas looked at me. He looked at the chaos around us. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "I believe we do, son," he said. "I believe we do." The chaos in the boardroom was a living thing, a creature of noise and panic that swirled around the mahogany table. But I stood in the eye of the storm completely still, my hand resting on the laptop that had just delivered my father's final message. Victoria was being held back by two security guards, her chest heaving, her face a mask of ruined mascara and pure, unadulterated venom. She was screaming that the video was a fabrication, a digital puppet show created by a desperate criminal. "That is AI!" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at the blank screen. "That is a deep fake! I will sue you for defamation! I will sue you for fraud! I have the best forensic experts in the country on speed dial, you filthy little mechanic! You think a cartoon on a screen overrides a legal will?" Arthur Thorne, the traitorous lawyer, seemed to regain a shred of his composure. He smoothed his tie, though his hands were shaking violently. "Mrs. Sterling raises a valid point," Thorne stammered, looking at the board members who were murmuring amongst themselves. "Technology today is deceptive. Without forensic authentication, this video is inadmissible. We have a signed will from 1995. A digital file found in a basement is hardly—" I did not let him finish. I reached into the accordion folder again. I did not pull out a digital drive this time. I pulled out paper, old paper, the kind that smells of dust and time. I slid a yellowing document down the long, polished table. It spun across the wood and came to rest right in front of Silas Vance. Forensics can analyze that, I said, my voice cutting through the din. Silas picked it up. He put on his reading glasses. "What is this?" Silas asked. "It is a DNA test from a private clinic in Zurich, dated October 14th, 1995, I said, looking directly at Eric. Eric, who had been slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon, jerked his head up. I walked closer to him. "You were born in '96, Eric. My father knew something was wrong. He knew he and Victoria had not been intimate in months. So he hired a private investigator to track Victoria's movements during her spa retreats to Switzerland." I pointed to the paper in Silas's hand. She was not at a spa. She was at a ski lodge with her personal trainer, a man named Lars Jensen. My father managed to get a sample. That document proves with 99.9% certainty that Lars Jensen is your biological father. Eric's face turned a color I had never seen on a human being. A sickly, pale gray. "That is a lie!" Victoria screamed, struggling against the guards. "Robert forged it. He was paranoid. He was crazy." "He was not crazy," I said calmly. "He was heartbroken. But he kept the secret. He raised Eric as his own because he did not want to punish a child for the sins of the mother. He gave you a name, Eric. He gave you a life. And how did you repay him?" I reached into the folder again. This time, I pulled out a thick stack of spreadsheets and blueprints. I slammed them onto the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "You repaid him by hollowing out his legacy from the inside." I opened the file to a page marked with red tabs. "The Millennium Tower project," I said, addressing the board. "The jewel of the Sterling portfolio. Completed last year." I looked at Silas Vance. Eric was in charge of procurement. He switched the steel suppliers. He swapped out the structural I-beams for cheap, high-carbon imports from a shell company he owns in the Caymans. The board members gasped. This was not just theft. This was catastrophe. He pocketed the difference. I continued, my voice relentless. $40 million. And in exchange, he compromised the structural integrity of a building that houses 3,000 people. If there is a fire, if there is a high wind, that tower comes down. Silas Vance looked up from the documents, his face white with horror. He looked at Eric. "Is this true?" Silas whispered. Eric opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Victoria. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the door, calculating her exit. "It is all lies," Victoria shouted, playing her last desperate card. "These are just papers. Anyone can print papers. You have no authority. I am the majority shareholder. I control 51% of the voting stock." She shook off the guards and stood up, smoothing her dress with trembling hands. "This meeting is adjourned," she declared, trying to summon the ghost of her former power. Security, remove this man. We will settle this in court. By the time this gets to a judge, I will have sold off the assets and—" "You do not control anything, Victoria," I interrupted. She froze. I walked back to the toolbox. The rusty, beat-up red box sitting on the $1,000,000 table. I opened the top compartment. I pushed aside a wrench and a roll of electrical tape. I picked up a small silver pen light. It was a UV inspection light. We used them in the shop to find leaks in air conditioning systems. My father was a man of structure, I said, turning the light over in my fingers. He knew you would try to bury the truth. He knew you would bribe lawyers. He knew you would shred documents. He knew that paper can be burned and digital files can be deleted. I unbuttoned the cuff of my left sleeve. I rolled it up, exposing the tattoo on my wrist, the crescent moon and the falcon wing. So he left the key in the only place he knew you could not touch. I looked at the tattoo. I remembered the night in the warehouse just before we left. Robert had held my wrist. He had said he wanted to check the healing of a scratch I got from the engine. He had dabbed something on it with a strange-smelling marker. Just antiseptic, he had said. It had not been antiseptic. I clicked the UV light on. A beam of purple light hit my skin. The room fell silent as they leaned in. Under the ultraviolet glare, the black ink of the tattoo seemed to recede, and a new layer emerged. Glowing in a bright neon blue, right in the center of the crescent moon, was a string of alphanumeric characters that had been invisible to the naked eye. CH 749902 Alpha. "What is that?" Arthur Thorne whispered, leaning forward, his eyes wide. "That," I said, "is the access code to the Sterling Future Fund." I looked at Silas Vance. "Mr. Vance, please access the Credit Suisse portal. Use the corporate master key." Silas, his hands trembling slightly, typed on his laptop. The image was projected onto the main screen behind me. He navigated to the secure login page for the bank. "Enter the code," I said. Silas typed in the glowing numbers from my wrist. "Access granted." A new window popped up. It showed a balance that made everyone in the room inhale sharply. It was a number with 9 zeros. But more importantly, under the tab labeled Asset Allocation, it listed a single holding. Sterling Real Estate Group. Class A, voting shares, 51%. I turned to Victoria. "My father moved the controlling stake into this trust 5 years ago," I said. "He set it up so that it could only be accessed by a specific combination. This code and a biometric confirmation from a direct male descendant." Silas clicked a button on the screen labeled Verify Identity. The system prompted for a fingerprint scan. But since I was not at the computer, I pulled out my phone. I had already linked my biometric data to the account when I opened the USB file earlier. I pressed my thumb to my phone screen. On the big screen, a green checkmark appeared. Identity confirmed. James Martinez, Sterling. Trustee authorized. I looked at Victoria. Her face had gone slack. The arrogance, the fight, the fury, it all drained out of her, leaving behind a hollow, terrified old woman. "You are fired, Victoria," I said. My voice was quiet, but it rang like a bell. "And you, Eric. You are both removed from the board effective immediately. You are stripped of all executive powers. And your access to company accounts has been revoked." Eric stared at his phone. He was frantically trying to transfer money. "It is not working!" he screamed, tapping the screen violently. "It says insufficient funds. It says account frozen." "That is because I froze them 10 minutes ago," I said. Victoria slumped into her chair. She looked small. She looked finished. But I was not done. I checked my watch. "Right on time," I said. The double doors at the back of the room burst open. This time, it was not private security. It was not a lawyer. It was a squad of 6 officers in windbreakers marked FBI, Economic Crimes Division, and Chicago PD. They moved with the efficiency of a hammer striking a nail. "Victoria Sterling!" the lead agent barked. Victoria looked up, dazed. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder," the agent said, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. "Murder?" she whispered. "We found the thallium in your vanity cabinet, Victoria," I said. "I gave the tip to the police yesterday. They executed a search warrant while you were getting your hair done for the funeral. We know you were poisoning his tea." The agent pulled her hands behind her back. The click of the handcuffs was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Eric saw his mother being cuffed. He saw the agents moving toward him. Panic primal, and stupid took over. "I am not going to jail," he shouted. He bolted. He scrambled away from the table, knocking over his leather chair. He sprinted toward the side exit, the door that led to the executive stairwell. He had to run past me to get there. I did not tackle him. I did not punch him. I did not dirty my hands. I just watched him come. He was running blindly, his eyes fixed on the exit sign. As he reached me, I simply extended my right leg. Just a few inches. His expensive Italian loafer caught on the toe of my work boot. Physics took over. Eric went flying. He flailed in the air for a second, a desperate, disjointed shape, before slamming face first onto the hard parquet floor. Crunch. He slid for 3 feet, coming to a stop right in front of the rusty toolbox. He groaned, rolling over. His nose was bleeding. His suit was crumpled. He looked up at me from the floor exactly where he belonged. I looked down at him. "Gravity," I said. "It is a structural law, Eric. What goes up on a foundation of lies must come down." The agents were on him in a second, hauling him up and cuffing his hands behind his back. "James," he pleaded, blood bubbling on his lips. "James, tell them. We are brothers. You cannot let them take me." "I am not your brother," I said coldly. "I am just the mechanic who fixed the mess you made." I turned back to the table. Silas Vance was standing looking at me with a mixture of awe and respect. The other board members were silent, waiting for my next move. I walked over to the laptop and closed it. I picked up the toolbox. I looked at Victoria one last time as the agents marched her out. She looked back at me, her eyes filled with a terrifying realization. She had spent 30 years trying to erase my mother and me, and in the end, we were the only thing left standing. "Take them away," I said to the agents. As the doors closed behind the fallen dynasty, the room was quiet. But it was not the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a clean slate. I looked at the tattoo on my wrist. The blue light had faded, leaving only the black ink, the crescent moon in the wing. "We did it, Dad," I whispered. "The engine is running again. The lobby of the Sterling Tower is designed to intimidate. It is a cathedral of glass and polished granite meant to make anyone walking through it feel small." But as the elevator doors opened and I stepped out, the intimidation was flowing in the opposite direction. The flashing lights were blinding. It looked like a thunderstorm had been trapped inside the building. A phalanx of police officers and federal agents formed a wedge, pushing through the sea of reporters. In the center of that wedge were the fallen royalty of Chicago. Victoria was first. She had lost her shoes. She was walking in her stocking feet on the cold stone floor, her head bowed, her expensive blonde hair falling in messy strands across her face. She was not screaming anymore. She looked like a ghost, drained of the malice that had sustained her for 30 years. Behind her, shuffling in leg irons that clinked with a heavy rhythmic sound, was Eric. He was weeping openly. It was a pathetic, snot-nosed sobbing that echoed off the high ceilings. He looked at the cameras with terrified eyes, shouting that it was a mistake, that he was a victim, that he needed his lawyer. But the lawyers were not coming. The lawyers were busy shredding their own files, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive crater that the Sterling name had become. I stood by the elevator bank watching them go. I did not feel joy. I did not feel the rush of victory I had expected. I felt a deep, exhausting relief, like setting down a heavy engine block I had been carrying for miles. As the revolving doors swallowed them up and spat them out into the waiting police vans, the camera lenses turned. Hundreds of them. They swung toward me like the heads of hydras. "Mr. Martinez, James, are you the new CEO? What is your comment on your brother's arrest? I did not stop. I did not give them a soundbite. I signaled to the head of building security, a man named Frank who had once looked at me with suspicion, but now looked at me with deference, and he cleared a path. I walked out the side exit into the cool, clean air of the alley. The war was over. Now the cleanup had to begin. 2 hours later, I was back in the boardroom. The police had left. The press had been cleared out. The air still smelled faintly of the panic sweat Eric had left behind, but the room was quiet. The remaining board members were sitting in their chairs looking at me. They were nervous. They were men and women who had spent their lives playing the corporate game, and they had no idea how to deal with a man who played by the rules of the street. I did not sit at the head of the table. I did not like that chair. It felt too much like a throne. Instead, I leaned against the windowsill, looking out at the city. I was still wearing my flannel shirt and my work boots. I had mud on my heel. I did not care. I turned to face them. I held a piece of paper in my hand. It was a list Silas Vance had printed out for me. "This company is sick," I said. My voice was not loud, but in the silence it carried. "It has a virus, and we are going to purge it." I looked at the list. Gregson, Chief Financial Officer, I read. A man with a comb-over and a tie that cost more than my truck stood up. He was sweating. "Yes, Mr. Martinez?" "You signed off on the invoices for the cheap steel used in the Millennium Tower," I said. "You knew the numbers did not add up. You knew Eric was skimming. And you looked the other way because you got a bonus at Christmas." "Mr. Martinez, I was under pressure," Gregson stammered. "You are fired," I said. "Pack your desk. You have 10 minutes. If you are not out of the building, security will throw you out. And Gregson, do not try to take a stapler. We are auditing everything." I went down the list. The Vice President of Operations, the Head of Legal Compliance, the Director of Public Relations who had helped Victoria spin the lies about my mother. One by one, I called their names. One by one, I stripped them of their titles and sent them packing. I did not yell. I did not negotiate. I just cut out the rot. By the time I was done, the room was half empty. The survivors looked terrified. I looked at Silas Vance. He was smiling. "What now, son?" Silas asked. "Now we rebuild," I said. "But not as Sterling Real Estate. That name is dead. That name means lies. That name means poison." I walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. I picked up a marker. "My father loved cars," I said. "He loved the mechanics of things. And my mother loved stories about rising from the ashes. She survived a fire to keep me safe. This company needs to survive this fire to keep this city safe." I wrote 2 words on the board in big block letters. "Phoenix Motors Homes." The board members whispered. "Motors?" one of them asked. "But we are a real estate firm." "Not anymore," I said. "We are a company that builds things. We build homes for people to live in, and we build machines that move them. We are going to diversify. We are going to invest in American manufacturing. We are going to bring the jobs back that men like Eric shipped overseas." I tapped the marker on the board. "The Phoenix," I said. "It is a bird that burns and is born again, just like the falcon on my wrist, just like this family." The vote was unanimous. The motion passed. The Sterling Empire was history. The Phoenix had risen. But there was one more thing I had to do before I could sleep. I sat down at the massive mahogany table. I pulled out a checkbook. Not the corporate one, but the checkbook for the trust fund. The billions that were now legally mine. I spent the next 4 hours writing. I wrote a check for $50,000 to the janitor Eric had fired for spilling coffee. I wrote a check for $100,000 to the secretary Victoria had humiliated and dismissed without severance. I wrote checks to the contractors who had been stiffed on payments. I wrote checks to the tenants who had been evicted illegally. My hand cramped. The ink ran low. But I kept writing. I was not just paying them back. I was buying back my father's soul. I was balancing the ledger that had been in the red for 30 years. When I finally put the pen down, it was dark outside. I felt lighter. I left the tower and drove my truck to the cemetery. The gates were closed, but the night watchman let me in. He knew who I was. Everyone knew who I was now. I walked to the family plot. It was a large marble area, cold and imposing. My mother's fresh grave was there, the earth still mounted high. Next to it was the open plot where they had buried Robert's casket earlier that day. They were finally together. Not in a cheap apartment, not in a secret meeting, but in the earth. I knelt down in the grass. The dampness seeped into my jeans. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the brass key. The key to the vault. The key that had started it all. I dug a small hole in the soil between their two headstones. I placed the key inside. "You gave me the structure, Dad," I whispered. "But I do not need the vault anymore. I carry the truth with me now." I covered the key with dirt. Then, I took the rusty red toolbox from the bed of my truck. I placed it at the foot of Robert's grave. It looked out of place among the marble angels and granite obelisks. It looked real. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence of the graveyard wash over me. I closed my eyes, and a memory hit me. A memory from just a week ago in the garage. I saw Robert falling to his knees. At the time, I had thought it was weakness. I had thought he was a broken old man crumbling under the weight of his guilt. I had pitied him. But now, standing here with the power of an empire in my hands, I understood. He had not knelt because he was weak. He had knelt because he was building a foundation. You cannot build anything tall unless you dig deep first. He had to lower himself. He had to touch the dirt. He had to break his own ego to connect with me. That kneel was the strongest thing he had ever done. It was the moment he stopped being a billionaire and started being a father. I wiped a tear from my cheek. "I will keep it running, Dad," I said to the wind. "I promise. The timing belt will never snap again." I turned and walked away. I did not look back. I drove south. I left the glittering skyline of the Gold Coast behind and headed toward the smoke and the grit of the industrial district. I pulled up to Iron and Dust. The lights were on. The bay doors were open. I could hear the sound of a ratchet wrench and the laughter of men. I walked in. The shop looked exactly the same. The calendars on the wall, the smell of grease, the vending machine that always ate your quarters. Tony was under a '67 Chevy Impala. He slid out on his creeper when he saw my boots. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at me. He looked at the clean clothes, the tired eyes, the aura of power that I couldn't quite shake off. For a second, I was afraid. I was afraid that I had become Mr. Sterling to him. I was afraid that the money had built a wall between us that no amount of friendship could breach. "Hey," Tony said. "Hey," I said. Silence stretched between us. The other mechanics stopped working. They were watching. "I heard you bought the place," Tony said. "The landlord called me. Said the building was sold to some outfit called Phoenix." "That you?" "Yeah," I said. "That is me," Tony nodded slowly. "So what is the plan? You gonna turn it into a parking lot, condos, a showroom for your fancy new life?" "No," I said. I walked over to the workbench and picked up a wrench. It felt good in my hand, heavy, honest. "I am turning it into a school," I said. Tony raised an eyebrow. "A school?" "A vocational center," I explained. "Free tuition. For every kid in this neighborhood who does not have the money for college, but has a brain in his head and hands that want to work. We are going to teach them how to weld, how to fix engines, how to restore things." I looked at Tony. "And I need a headmaster. I need someone who knows that you do not force a bolt, you finesse it." Tony stared at me. His hard-lined face softened. A slow grin spread across his mug. "Headmaster Tony," he chuckled. "Has a nice ring to it. But the pay better be good." I smiled. "The pay is double what you are making now, plus full benefits. And a stake in the company." Tony laughed. He walked over and punched me in the shoulder. It hurt. It was the best feeling in the world. "You are still a crazy bastard, James," he said. "I am not just James. I said, grabbing a beer from the mini fridge in the corner. The guys gathered around. We drank cheap beer and talked about carburetors. For an hour, I was not the CEO. I was not the heir. I was just one of the guys. But as I drove home that night back to the empty apartment that I would soon have to leave, the feeling settled on me again. I had won. I had saved the company. I had avenged my mother. I had honored my father. But as I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I saw the lines of exhaustion around my eyes. I saw the weight on my shoulders. Taking down the villains was the easy part. The hard part was what came next. I was responsible now. Responsible for thousands of employees. Responsible for billions of dollars. Responsible for a legacy that was fragile and new. Power is not a prize. It is a tool. And like any heavy tool, if you do not hold it right, it will break your wrist. I parked the truck. I looked up at the stars above Chicago. I flexed my hand. The scar on my wrist where the tattoo had burned into the skin felt tight. I was ready. Winning the war did not feel like a triumph. It felt like moving into a mausoleum. For the first month after the board meeting, I lived in the Sterling estate. It was a sprawling stone fortress on the North Shore filled with rooms I never entered, and silence that rang in my ears like tinnitus. I slept in a bed that cost more than my first 3 cars combined, yet I woke up with a backache every morning. The staff treated me with a terrified reverence, jumping every time I walked into a room. I was the new king, but the crown was heavy, and it was cold, and it did not fit. I found myself wandering the hallways at night, looking at the portraits of ancestors I did not know. I felt like a squatter in my own life. I had the billions. I had the power. I had the vindication. But I missed the smell of coffee burning on a hot plate. I missed the sound of a socket wrench ratcheting against a bolt. I missed the struggle. The only thing that gave me purpose was the vocational center. We had fast-tracked the renovation of the Iron and Dust Garage. It was no longer just a repair shop. It was a state-of-the-art academy. We had installed new lifts, digital diagnostic stations, and a classroom with actual desks. We had 20 students enrolled for the first semester. Kids from the neighborhood who, like me, had grease in their blood and nowhere to go. One night in late February, I was at the center late. I was going over the curriculum for the introductory welding course. The students had gone home. Tony had locked up the front office. It was just me and the hum of the refrigerator. Then I smelled it. It was a scent that triggered a primal alarm in my brain. It was not the smell of oil or exhaust. It was sharper, sweet, chemical, gasoline. I stood up my chair, scraping against the concrete. The smell was coming from the back bay where we stored the tires. I ran toward the door. Before I could reach it, the world turned orange. A whoosh of air knocked me backward as the rear windows blew out. Flames, hungry and violent, roared into the shop. They licked up the walls, devouring the old posters and the new drywall. The heat was instantaneous and suffocating. I scrambled to my feet, coughing. The fire alarm began to scream. I turned to run for the front exit, but then I heard a sound that froze my blood. "Help!" It was a muffled cry coming from the supply closet near the back. I stopped. My heart hammered against my ribs. I knew that voice. It was Miguel, one of my youngest students. He had asked to stay late to organize the tool crib for extra credit. I thought he had left. The fire was between me and the closet. For a second, I was paralyzed. I was not in the garage anymore. I was back in the story my mother had told me 1,000 times. The story of the fire that was supposed to kill her. The fire that had defined our lives. The fire was the weapon of the Sterlings. It was their way of erasing mistakes. But I was not a mistake, and I was not going to let history repeat itself. I grabbed a heavy canvas welding blanket from the workbench. I dunked it into the wash sink, soaking it in water. I threw it over my head, and I ran into the fire. The heat was physical, a solid wall that tried to push me back. The smoke was thick and black, stinging my eyes, filling my lungs with poison. I could feel the hair on my arms, singeing. "Miguel!" I screamed. I kicked the door of the supply closet. It was jammed, warped by the heat. I kicked it again, and again. On the third strike, the wood splintered. Miguel was huddled in the corner, coughing, his eyes wide with terror. He looked at me like I was an angel of death. "Move!" I roared. I grabbed him. I threw the wet blanket over both of us. We had to run back through the gauntlet. The ceiling was burning now. Debris was falling like rain. A burning beam, part of the old roof structure, gave way with a sickening crack. It came down right as we passed under it. I shoved Miguel forward hard. He stumbled out of the way. The beam crashed down. It missed my head, but it caught my left arm. The pain was white hot. It was not an impact. It was a consumption. The burning wood seared through my flannel shirt and bit into my skin. I screamed a sound that was lost in the roar of the inferno. I yanked my arm free, leaving skin behind. Adrenaline masked the worst of it. I scrambled over the debris, pushing Miguel toward the front door. We burst out into the cool night air, collapsing onto the asphalt of the parking lot. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air, clutching my arm. The pain was starting to bloom now, a rhythmic throbbing that synchronized with my heartbeat. "James!" Miguel was crying. "James, your arm!" I looked up. The sky was lit up by the orange glow of my dream burning down. And there, standing by the chain-link fence, illuminated by the flames of the building he had torched, was a figure. He was wearing a dark hoodie, but the face was unmistakable. It was a face I had seen in boardrooms and on magazine covers. But now, it was twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged madness. Eric. He had made bail. Of course he had. Even frozen assets leak enough for a bail bondsman. He was standing there watching the fire, a gas can still in his hand. He was smiling. He looked like a child who had finally broken the toy he could not have. He saw me looking at him. His smile faltered. He realized I was alive. He turned to run, but he did not get far. Blue lights swarmed the parking lot. Sirens wailed. I had tripped the silent alarm the moment I smelled the gas. Eric ran 2 steps before a police cruiser jumped the curb and cut him off. 2 officers tackled him into the snow. This time, there was no dignity. There were no lawyers. He screamed and kicked, dragging his heels in the slush, a pathetic, broken man who had tried to burn down the future because he could not own the past. I watched them cuff him. I watched them shove him into the car. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I would never see him again. He would die in a cage. Then the darkness took me, and I passed out. I woke up in a hospital bed. It was clean, white, and quiet. My left arm was bandaged from elbow to wrist. It felt stiff tight. A doctor was standing by the window, looking at a chart. He turned when I stirred. "Mr. Martinez," he said softly, "you are awake. You took in a lot of smoke. And that burn on your arm was 3rd degree. We had to do some grafting." I tried to sit up. "Miguel?" "The boy is fine," the doctor smiled. "He has a few scrapes, but he is home with his parents. He told us what you did." I looked at my arm. "Can I see it?" I asked. The doctor hesitated. "It is not going to look pretty, James. You had a tattoo there." "A falcon, I think." I nodded. He began to unwrap the gauze. Layer by layer, the white strips fell away. When the final layer was removed, I looked down. The skin was angry red and puckered. The perfect lines of Robert's design were gone. The falcon's wing was distorted, twisted by the scar tissue. The crescent moon was jagged, broken by a ridge of healed flesh. The doctor looked apologetic. "We tried to save the design, but the tissue damage was too deep." "I am sorry." I stared at it for a long time. I traced the scar with my right hand. It was rough. It was real. It was no longer a drawing made by a man I barely knew for a woman he lost. It was a mark of my own making. It was a receipt for a life saved. I smiled. "Don't be sorry, Doc," I said. "It is better this way." "Better?" he asked. I looked at the twisted, scarred wing. It looked like a bird that had flown through a storm and survived. "Now," I said, "now it is truly mine." I left the hospital 3 days later. I did not go back to the mansion. I called Silas Vance. I told him to list the Sterling estate, sell it, sell the furniture, sell the art, sell the gate. He asked me what I wanted to do with the money. It was nearly $80 million. I told him I wanted to build. My mother's dream was never to be rich. Her dream was to be safe. She wanted a door that locked and a roof that didn't leak. She wanted a place where no one could threaten her. We launched the Maria Initiative a month later. We did not just build cheap apartments. We built neighborhoods. We bought up the abandoned lots on the south side, the places the city had forgotten. We built row houses with brick facades and front porches. We built parks. We built community centers. We sold them to working families at cost. We gave them zero-interest loans backed by the Sterling Trust. We gave them the one thing my mother never had: ownership. 2 years later, the Chicago sun was shining bright and fierce. It was the kind of summer day that made you forgive the winter. I was standing in the main bay of the Phoenix Vocational Center. We had rebuilt it bigger and better than before. The scorch marks on the concrete floor were still there, sealed under a clear coat of epoxy, a reminder of where we had come from. I was wearing my favorite coveralls. They were stained with oil and grease. My hands were black with carbon. I was leaning over the engine bay of a 1965 Mustang, showing a new student how to adjust the timing. "Listen to it," I said to the kid. His name was Leo. He was 17, skinny and eager. "Don't just look at the timing light. Listen to the heartbeat. If it stumbles, it is telling you something." Leo nodded, his eyes wide, listening intently to the engine's idle. Outside, the gravel crunched under tires. A car pulled up. It was a brand new Bentley Continental, sleek and silver gleaming in the sun. It was a car that cost $250,000. The driver's door opened. A man in a sharp suit stepped out. He looked nervous. He checked his watch. He looked at the grime on the walls of the shop. He walked into the bay. "Excuse me," he said, looking for someone in charge. "I am looking for Mr. Martinez. James Martinez." I did not stop working. I gave the carburetor screw a quarter turn. The engine purred, smoothing out into a perfect rhythm. "That is me," I said, not looking up. The man blinked. He looked at my dirty hands. He looked at my sweat-stained collar. "Oh," he said, confused. "I have an appointment. I am the regional director for the governor's office. We are here to discuss the expansion grant for the housing project." I wiped my hands on a rag. I stood up. I walked over to him. I did not apologize for the dirt. I did not rush to wash up. I extended my hand, the one with the blackened fingernails and the twisted scar on the wrist. I looked him in the eye. I smiled. It was not the smile of a mechanic who needed a job. It was the smile of a man who owned the ground he stood on. "I know who you are," I said, "and the grant is too low. We need double what you are offering, or I build it myself, and the governor does not get his name on the plaque." The man swallowed hard. He looked at my hand, then he looked at my face. He saw something there that made him straighten his tie. "I see," he stammered. "I am sure we can discuss the figures." We walked into my office. It was a glass box in the corner of the shop overlooking the floor. As I sat down at my desk, I looked out the window. I saw the students working. I saw the sparks flying from the welding booths. I saw the future being built one weld at a time. I looked up at the blue sky through the skylight. "Dad, Mom," I whispered. I touched the scar on my wrist. I did not let the money change me. I changed the money. I made it work. I made it sweat. I made it serve the people who actually bleed for it. The sun caught the scar on my arm. For a second, it did not look like ruined flesh. It looked like a wing made of fire and gold. It looked like it was catching an updraft, lifting me, lifting all of us higher than any skyscraper in this city. I am James Martinez. I am a mechanic, and I finally fixed it. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey, and I hope it touched something in you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Are you in a garage, a kitchen, a car, or maybe just relaxing at home? Please drop a comment below and let me know your location and what you thought of James's choice at the end. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to Calm Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can share this story with more people who need a reminder that true power comes from the heart, not the wallet.